Hi there, I'm William Seymour, and today I'm going to be presenting our paper on unpacking perceptions of smartness and related ethical concerns in the home. After decades of existence in popular imagination, the promise of the smart home of the future is gradually becoming a reality. But when we consider the smart devices available today, there are very real ethical concerns about the privacy, autonomy, transparency, and social effects of these devices once they're integrated into everyday life. The home environment contains finely balanced social equilibria that technology is apt to disrupt. But when these effects are studied, there's a lot of ambiguity around what smartness actually is. Some papers take it to be self-evident. You'll know a smart device when you see one, while others restrict themselves to a subset of devices, such as anything marketed as a smart TV. But when being smart is a cause for concern, these approaches can ignore how functionality shared between devices contributes to people's perceptions of smartness and the ethical concerns that occur as a result. These investigations also tend to exist at either a high level, like smart homes in general threatening principles of privacy, or at a low level, like smart meter agents specifically raising concerns about the transparency of energy companies, and this tends to generate insights that can be overly generic or specific. Both specificity and generality have their place. Specificity has a high ecological validity within the context in question, whereas broad ethical principles are useful for informing policy or design initiatives which have to be adaptable to multiple contexts. However, they're less useful if we want to understand how ethical concerns are generated from devices and use cases. To this end, we examine how end users conceptualize smartness beyond specific devices and contexts, and how these formulations relate to the particular ethical concerns that arise through device usage. We began by running a survey that approached the question of smartness from a number of different angles. We ran the survey with 20 owners of 6 different types of smart device, for a total of 120 participants. 3 researchers independently used thematic analysis to generate initial codes for these responses, which were then combined to produce distinct types of smart functionality that were fed into the interview protocol. As expected, different conceptions of smartness were often mixed together. Sometimes being marketed as smart was enough to make users see their devices as better, but smartness was also framed more neutrally, or even negatively. The survey results made it clear that for certain devices, such as TVs and speakers, there was an obvious capability or feature that users associated with that device being smart. Analysis of the survey results yielded the 8 features seen here that were believed to contribute to device smartness. The interviews explored how these different dimensions of smartness related to users' ethical concerns about devices. We began by establishing a baseline of the amount of experience each participant had with the 6 devices, and then instead of just asking them to respond to the types of smartness individually, we wanted to capture how their concerns operated between devices and contexts. To this end, we created a set of functionality cards that named each type of smartness and gave a brief description. We asked participants to choose the set of cards that they thought best represented the functionality each device had, and these were intended to form a mental scaffolding to help people consider devices and smartness in ways that they hadn't done so before. To go beyond immediate reactions to these devices, we then arranged the cards according to the functionality the devices actually had, and asked participants to respond to 4 smart home vignettes. These were drawn from papers on ethical concerns in smart homes, and participants were asked which devices they would be concerned about in the context of the vignette, and whether adding or removing functionality cards from the devices might alleviate those concerns. The first vignette described a family where parents used smart devices to monitor what their teenage children were doing. The second asked participants to imagine a home where device manufacturers tried to generate as much profit from the inhabitants as possible. The third vignette was concerned with places housing more vulnerable people, such as care homes or assisted living facilities. And the final scenario described a rental situation where smart devices had been installed by the landlord or other tenants. After an initial coding pass of the transcripts for references to devices and types of smartness, the data was divided between 3 members of the research team, who independently coded it for themes before convening to merge and consolidate them. These joint codes were then reapplied to the data to arrive at the final analysis. We recruited 15 participants representing a range of age, gender, and experience with smart devices for interviews that lasted about 30 to 45 minutes. I'm now going to present an overview of the results of 4 of the 6 types of smartness. The full results can be found in the paper, and transcripts are available on the Open Science Framework. Delegation was mainly seen as beneficial when undertaking monitoring activities related to safety and security, such as around household appliances or less able relatives. But where this triggered action in the real world, participants were concerned that poorly informed choices could have a detrimental effect on money or social relationships. In general, delegation was preferred when its mechanisms were well understood and seen as reliable. We often saw that delegation and learning were contrasted with the idea of being in control of devices. Connectedness was seen as being core to the concept of smartness. In fact, often during the interviews, participants would consider which cards they'd remove to alleviate concerns, touch the connected card, and then pause. Interestingly, connectedness was seen as all or nothing, how much data to send outside of the home, rather than a selective process based on who needed different types of information. As might be expected, privacy was a prominent concern when it came to voice control. The idea that devices were always listening made participants uncomfortable. But beyond this, devices waiting for users to say something were felt to have a social presence, like a stranger in the room. Many participants were positive about the possibilities of voice control as an enabling technology, but this was often in the context of other people, rather than themselves. And finally, sensing and responding were often discussed together, and were seen as a risk when they might compromise the privacy of others in the home, potentially undermining relationships. These risks were strongly related to the fidelity of the information that devices were capturing, such as the difference between a camera sensing the presence of a person versus using facial recognition to determine exactly who it was. Our discussion focuses on ethical concerns as they operate across devices and use cases. Unsurprisingly, privacy was the most prevalent concern in the interviews. But different triggers created concerns that operated at distinct levels, such as fundamental facts about device behavior, feelings of being watched, or the violation of social and relationship norms. Often, these basic questions being unanswered led to skepticism and the type of dejected acceptance that we've seen in prior studies. Learning and delegation were often contrasted with control, but they were also the examples participants gave as most beneficial for older adults. Here we see how different perceptions of ability lead to appeals to different types of autonomy, both as negative and positive liberties. Freedom from interference versus the ability to take control of one's life. Other concerns, particularly around connectedness and sensing, were focused on the social order of the home, putting strain on household administrators by forcing them to take deliberate action to avoid breaching the trust of their cohabitants. Finally, the ability for manufacturers to promote future purchases through closed ecosystems, such as app stores, or by incompatibility with other brands' devices, was seen as a conflict of interest, or even anti-competitive, ultimately reducing the usefulness of a device. In terms of limitations, while it didn't prevent the emergence of major themes, the exploratory nature of our study meant that our participants represented a relatively small set of independent adults, leading to the erasure of more marginalized views, as evidenced perhaps by the willingness of participants to recommend smart devices for older adults that they wouldn't use themselves. Though we did attempt to mitigate this with vignettes that were applicable to a wide span of social situations and lifestyles. In conclusion, it's often unclear what justifies the smart moniker that many smart home devices have. The results presented here are intended to begin exploring this design space of smartness, with the accounts given by our participants helping to cut through the nebulous use of smart in both the marketing of these devices and in academic research. While understandings of smartness are unlikely to have neat boundaries, by outlining some of these rough edges, we aim to help designers better anticipate how other devices and contexts might influence ethical concerns about their own. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them via email.